What would you do if you encountered something so shadowy and taboo that it caused you to reevaluate everything you believed about your family? I never imagined I would discover him in the hallway at 200 a.m., my heart pounding so fiercely. I could sense it in my chest, gazing at the light of a laptop screen through the narrow gap in my stepson's bedroom door. The house lay in silence, my husband resting down the hall, blissfully ignorant of the tempest poised to shatter our lives. I ought to have simply turned back, walked away, and acted as if I hadn't noticed a thing. I never anticipated it, but that single lapse in judgment unraveled everything. The evening of transformation began with a subtle hint, a slight stir of motion. I rose to fetch a glass of water, my bare feet whispering against the hardwood floors. The house was eerily silent, a stillness that envelops the night where secrets find solace in the shadows. Then I heard it, a gentle, steady sound emanating from Jake's room. My stepson, at the age of 25, is currently living with us as he works towards saving for his own home. He appeared to be a decent young man. I convinced myself that I was merely looking in on him, wondering if perhaps he was unwell or required assistance. As I glanced through the slightly ajar door, I found myself paralyzed. The glow of the blue light from his laptop illuminated the room. His expression was fierce, and his fingers danced rapidly over the keyboard. Then I came across the video. That's when it dawned on me. It wasn't merely a video. It was a reflection of us, my husband and me. Intimate instances that were meant to remain hours tapes I was unaware of. My stomach sank. The glass of water I held trembled. For how long had he been observing this? How did he manage to arrive at this point? And most troubling of all, why didn't I let out a scream? I ought to have reached out to my husband, should have stormed in there, and insisted on getting answers. However, I did not. Instead, I merely stood there, paralyzed by an elusive feeling I couldn't quite identify. It was a blend of terror and an unsettling, guilty intrigue. In that moment, I perceived a distinct spark in Jake's eyes. It was more than mere curiosity. It was a deep-seated desire, and it was directed towards me. The clandestine transition. The following days felt like an endless ordeal. I avoided Jake. I hardly engaged in conversation with my husband on each occasion. I closed my eyes and beheld that haunting image. The intensity of Jake's gaze lingered in my thoughts. It left me feeling nauseated. What was it that kept my mind circling back to it? What made me feel all tingly when he passed by me in the hall? Why did my heart skip a beat when he smiled at me at breakfast, as if everything was perfectly fine? And why did a part of me feel somewhat flattered? The allure was one that threatened to dismantle it all. I was aware of it. It was an error. I was aware it would ruin my marriage. Ignake was engaging in a perilous wager that transcended mere curiosity. However, the most troubling aspect was that I found myself beginning to get drawn in as well. I once believed I had everything in my life perfectly mapped out. In those days, I would have described myself as a devoted partner, a grounded individual who made wise decisions. My name is Ella Carter, though now I go by Ella Mitchell since marrying Richard. 7 years ago, at the age of 38, we crossed paths shortly after my divorce, and I approached the prospect of love with great caution. Richard stood apart. He was a finance advisor, composed and unflappable. The woman felt a sense of security. She had a son from her first marriage, Jake, who was 21 when I entered their lives. In those days, Jake was merely a reserved teenager, preferring video games over conversations. I maintained a courteous demeanor towards him, though we didn't share a particularly close bond. He referred to me as Elaine and Mom, which I found perfectly acceptable. He had no intention of taking anyone's place. For years, everything felt routine until Jake graduated and left for college, and I believe that marked the conclusion of it all. However, his return brought a sense of unease. At 25, Jake returned home 6 months ago after experiencing job loss, secured a position in the city. Richard was absolutely thrilled as he was putting away some cash. Intelligent child. Kept reassuring myself that it was only a phase, yet Jake had transformed. He was no longer the same boy I once knew. He stood taller now, exuding a quiet confidence that enveloped the entire room. He began exercising in our home gym. I caught fleeting glimpses of him through the doorway, beads of sweat shimmering on his shoulders. I would avert my gaze, feeling a twinge of irritation at myself for paying attention. Then there were the small details, such as how he would hang around when he was damp, and that mischievous grin he'd flash at me when I reprimanded him for leaving. Dishes in the sink. The moment I inadvertently entered while I was cleansing my hands, and it ended up taking more time than I had anticipated. He believed it was merely my arrogance, which was quite irritating. For a week after the videos were released, I steered clear of spending time with Jake. I made an effort to keep Richard nearby, and I even considered discussing it with him. But what could I possibly say? Was your son watching videos of us? That was incredibly awkward and uncomfortable. One evening, Richard departed for a business trip, reminding us to be on our best behavior. He playfully pressed a kiss to my cheek at the door, and the moment his car disappeared down the street, the atmosphere in the house grew heavy. I was simply occupied. I found myself in the kitchen, scrubbing a counter that was perfectly clean. Suddenly, I caught the sound of Jake's voice, deep and measured, drifting in from behind me. I pivoted, clutching the rim of the sink. He leaned against the counter arms, crossed observing me, with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. As he spoke, he remarked that the discussion had ventured beyond acceptable boundaries. I anticipated a reaction of denial or defensiveness, yet Jake remained disturbingly composed. "I know you saw," he remarked, closing the distance between them. My heart pounded with intensity. I likely ought to have simply turned and left. Out. I referred to Richard in a certain way, but I didn't. I murmured softly, for a time. His gaze was fixed on me. "You're even more stunning in person." The word sent a thrill through me, leaving me feeling flushed and self-conscious. Did he move a bit nearer? He kept his gaze steady that night. Indeed, he was observing. My face flushed with heat because he was correct. The perilous game was about to commence. In the days that followed, Jake made a trip to see his aunt. He glided by me in the hallway, his touch lingering just a fraction too long as he exited his room. The door stood ajar, with the light from his laptop spilling into the room. I noticed him observing me from the other side of the table, and his foot persistently brushed against mine beneath it. I could never detach swiftly enough. The most challenging moment came when I opted for lighter pajamas and left my robe unfastened, allowing him to catch me gazing. The experience was nothing short of intense. We were both challenging one another to take the plunge. I repeatedly reassured myself of my control, yet Jake seemed perpetually 2 steps ahead. On the night when everything changed, a tempest arrived. The entire house was engulfed in darkness due to a power outage. Richard remained motionless. The sound of Jake reached my ears long before his figure came into view. His voice lingered just behind me, and the shadows felt oppressive. His warm breath against my neck intensified the unease. Suddenly the power cut off, and a tempest erupted outside, shaking the windows as if a vengeful spirit were attempting to enter. The darkness had enveloped the room for nearly an hour, with the sole source of light being the sporadic flashes of lightning, casting eerie silhouettes upon the walls. I sensed Jake looming far too near behind me in the dim kitchen, his form pressing against my back. Fear gripped me, and his voice barely reached my ears. The sound reached me through the relentless downpour. I swallowed hard as Hammy's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. Naturally, it was merely a storm. His soft laugh sent an unsettling shiver down my spine. Deceiver. Then his hands began to shift. Where could I possibly be unhurried? Systematic. This is what I desired. My breath hitched as his thumbs traced delicate circles just above my hips. Jake. I gave him a warning, yet my voice wavered. He leaned in, his lips softly brushing against my ear. Command me to cease. Another flash of lightning illuminated his face for just an instant. His dark eyes were locked onto me, brimming with desire. I parted my lips, yet silence enveloped me. It felt as though I had crossed an irreversible boundary. He tightened his hold, drawing my back into him, and I could sense his heartbeat against my shoulder, rapid and unyielding. See? He whispered. You don't want me to stop. Yet my body betrayed me, leaning into his touch, my skin igniting wherever his hands roamed. This was destined to occur. I typically didn't embody this type of woman. In that moment, I was no longer Elaine Mitchell, the dutiful wife and stepmother. I was merely a woman who had been neglecting the heat for far too long, bubbling just beneath the surface. And Jake. In that instant, he wasn't my stepson. He was simply a guy who had desired me for what felt like an eternity, and at last I was prepared to surrender to him. The moments that followed were a flurry of entwined bodies and hurried breaths. The kitchen counter pressed against my back as he lifted me and placed me on it. His mouth crashed against mine, tasting of whiskey and something more profound. I should have felt guilty, perhaps even ashamed, but all I felt was a rush of life. After what felt like an eternity, I found myself free from the burdens of grocery lists, mortgage payments, and the anxiety of Richard's potential tardiness. Jake was not considering anything either. I was experiencing a whirlwind of emotions, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating, yet it felt entirely out of place. Yet I found it impossible to halt the unfolding events that followed. When it came to an end, silence enveloped us. Jake was the first to break away, his breath coming in heavy gasps as he averted his eyes from mine. I tumbled off the counter, my legs unsteady and my attire in disarray. The lights abruptly illuminated, harsh and scrutinizing. I looked up. I finally gazed at him, truly gazed at him for the first time since everything unfolded. His expression was completely devoid of emotion. He simply turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me there, my lips still tingling. My heart raced, and I found myself repeating, "What have I done?" It was then that the deception began. Richard returned. Home the following day, utterly bewildered. "Misadu," he murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to my cheek. I managed to smile. Same here. Jake pretended that everything was fine, laughing with his dad and assisting with the groceries. Evan inquired directly in front of Richard if I wanted coffee. It wasn't going to happen with him all over me. Less than 24 hours before that, I'd messed everything up, so I tried to keep my distance. I told myself it was just a mistake, a one-time thing. But 3 nights later, I woke up to a soft knock on my bedroom door. Richard was snoring next to me. The knock came again. I knew what was happening, and I really didn't want to, but I got up to see who it was. The knocking was so soft, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then it came again. 3 quick taps. That rhythm. There's no doubt about it. Richard lay beside me, lost in a deep and steady slumber, his breaths rhythmic and calm. The digital clock on the nightstand illuminated the room with its glaring red numbers, reading 2:18 a.m. I truly ought to have stayed in bed. I really shouldn't have opened that door. However, upon seeing Jake there, in just his wet shorts, his exposed chest illuminated by the soft glow of the hallway nightlight, I found myself unable to resist. "We need to talk," he murmured. My fingers clenched the doorknob with increasing intensity. Not present. Not at this moment. He cast a fleeting look at Richard, who remained in slumber. Then he turned back to me with a slow, knowing smile. "We struck a risky deal and met in the Basement. 10 minutes later, I was wrapped in a robe, clinging to Jake like he was some lame shield, while he leaned against the washing machine with that same annoying confidence. I whispered, "This could happen again," keeping my voice down even. With 2 floors between us and Richard. Jake tilted his head and I knew it was wrong, but it felt right. He pushed off the machine and closed the gap between us in just 2 strides, admitting "You haven't." Sighed. I ceased to ponder it. My treacherous body trembled as I sensed a finger glide down my arm. I managed to say, "I'm Mario to your dad, and still Harry." "You were present." His hands encircled my waist, drawing me near in the stillness of the early morning hour. That's when the falsehoods begin to take on a sense of reality. The following minute unfolded in a haze of furtive instances and unrelenting dread. Swift pecks exchanged in the kitchen as Richard enjoyed his shower, Jake's hand gliding up my thigh beneath the table. That moment I nearly got discovered when Richard arrived home ahead of schedule. We were positioned uncomfortably close to one another. Each encounter left me feeling increasingly captivated, yet simultaneously repulsed by my own reactions. Then one morning, I realized I was weeks late to be exact. I gazed at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, appearing pale and unwell. The pregnancy test from the drugstore lay untouched on the counter, encased in its plastic wrapper, crinkling in my trembling hands. This cannot be real. We exercised caution, primarily. A sudden knock at the door startled me, causing me to jump. It was unexciting, Richard reaching out to Dee. Very well then. They are perfectly fine. It escaped swiftly. Shoving the test into my pocket, my stomach churned. I bided my time until he departed for work to take the test. Those 3 minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly. When the second pink line appeared, I felt as though I might faint. That afternoon, when the house was empty, I confronted Jake. "We need to talk," I murmured, placing the positive test gently into his hands. He simply exclaimed, "Shut up." Yet, to my astonishment, he was brimming with excitement. "This is perfect," he exclaimed, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Richard is set to depart, and we can at last bring this to a close." Hiding, I recoiled as if struck. "You honestly believe I would abandon my husband for you?" His expression grew grim. "You already did, each time you allowed me to touch you." The weight of his words struck me deeply. "You have 3 days to tell him," Jake said with a steady voice, "or I will." That evening, I observed Richard as he enjoyed his dinner, completely oblivious to the impending explosion that would shatter his world. If I were to tell him he would trust my words and the child would be raised without a father figure, our families would be shattered if I revealed the truth about Jake and me, would reveal everything. Richard would discover the truth sooner or later. The other option was far more daunting. In the early hours of the morning, a frantic decision led me to pack a suitcase, leave a note, and place my wedding ring on the kitchen counter before stepping out. The sound of my tires crunching over gravel echoed as I merged onto the desolate highway. The streetlights cast fleeting shadows across my windshield. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, with my suitcase haphazardly tossed in the back seat. I had no clear destination, only an overwhelming urge to escape. Jake. Distance from Richard, remote from the existence I ruined. My phone vibrated for the 10th time. I simply overlooked it. Suddenly, Richard's name appeared on the screen. Esther. Mac was in a state of panic. He must have noticed the note. I directed it to voicemail. It pertained to the motor room malfunction. I pulled into a roadside motel just as dawn was breaking. It's the type of spot where the walls are paper thin and a stale odor greets you the moment you walk through the door. As soon as I shut the door, I collapsed onto the rough bed, crying with deep, shuddering breaths that left my ribs aching. I felt like a coward or a monster, and now I was holding something that might not even belong to my husband. Once more my phone vibrated, This time it was a text. Richard. Elaine reached out to me. Whatever this may be, we can work through it together. A sudden surge of guilt washed over me. He believed this was concerning us. He was completely unaware that the treachery ran far deeper than he could have imagined. I turned off my phone. A knock echoed at the door. I must have drifted off, for the next thing I realized was the sound of someone pounding on the door. Elaine opened it, and Jake's voice reached my ears. I leaped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello there," he remarked. The noise intensified, and I realized you were within. I crept quietly to the door, glancing through the crack. Through the fisheye lens, I caught a glimpse of Jake, his appearance disheveled and his eyes wild with Richard standing behind him. My heart plummeted. I swung the door open just in time to prevent them from rousing the entire motel. Jake burst in his face, flushed with fury, and shouted, "What on earth were you thinking just walking out?" Gritched appeared equally bewildered and terrified. "Elaine," Jake said, his voice trembling. "You too." The room began to swirl around him. Jake had mentioned my open Emmy to him. I parted my lips, yet silence prevailed. What can I possibly express? Jake gazed at his father, his tone remarkably serene. "She's expecting, Dad, and it's my responsibility." Richard's complexion drained of color, and I felt as though I had been struck in the stomach. "How long?" he murmured. "Jake Longino." Richard emitted a sound I'd never encountered, a blend of a sob and a growl, and then he abruptly turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him as if it were the end of everything. Since that moment, Jake merely chuckled, yet it was a hollow, desolate sound. "Well, that went well," he remarked, as I gazed at him, truly noticing him for the first time. He appeared quite self-satisfied. The angle of his mouth and the gaze in his eyes seemed deliberate. This wasn't affection. It was a competition, and I was tardy to understand that I had already been defeated. I couldn't help but think, as Jake shrugged, that this was what you wanted. You were my desire, and everything else was merely a consequence. In an instant, everything fell into place. The video, the pregnancy test, he had orchestrated it all. He leaned in, his voice low. "No, Elaine, you stepped into this fully aware. And the most troubling aspect." He was correct. I snatched my purse, and Jake's hand darted out, clutching my arm. "Wrist, where do you all think you're going?" Pulled away from you for good. His grin disappeared. "You won't make it by yourself." I stared him right in the eyes. "Just watch me." Then I walked out, leaving the motel, the lies, and Jake behind. First morning alone, the sun came up over a rundown diner on the edge of town. Its buzzing fluorescent lights sounded like angry bugs. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup that was way past cold. Deetris, a tired-looking woman with a name tag that said Dolores had refill day. She asked me 3 times without checking in, you good Han. Finally, she wiped her hands on her apron. I was about to say something, but then I just broke down and cried. I ended up staring at our hands together. Hers were rough, but mine felt empty, still showing the mark where my wedding ring used to be. I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I realized Dalla was holding my hand tighter than he usually does. Yep, just the first day of trying to figure all this out. Then, 2 weeks later, Richard Ziva's papers showed up. No phone call, no negotiations, just a plain manila envelope. I found myself standing at the entrance of my new apartment. A quaint studio perched above a laundromat that exuded an aroma of detergent intertwined with a hint of regret. I anticipated a flood of anger in the document's genuine spite, but all I received was complete silence. Richard made no effort to contest the house, the cars, or the savings. He simply turned and left a pain deeper than any argument could inflict. At 7 months pregnant, I was discovered by Jake, who had just landed a position at a quaint little bookstore. My belly made it difficult to access the high shelves, yet it left me with an odd aching sensation. Off comfort, the baby kicked a reminder of my missteps more than on a rainy Tuesday. The bell above Theodore chimed, and there he stood dripping on the welcome mat. "You look good pregnant," he remarked, as if no time had passed. My hands instinctively went to Miss Stack. "Get out." Jake disregarded Miss, meandering through the aisles, leaving footprints of my thoughts everywhere. "Baby, there's no baby where you're concerned," I hissed, lowering my voice to avoid my boss's notice. He leaned in, his breath warm against my ear. "There is, in fact, a legal basis for this. I would like to obtain a DNA test from the hospital where I gave birth." I found myself completely alone. No birthing classes, no prepared bag, no enthusiastic partner supporting me during the contractions. Just me gasping through the agony in a taxi, hoping the driver wouldn't see the liquid seeping into his back seat. In that moment, bright lights surrounded me, and a voice urged me to push. Suddenly, my daughter arrived perfect, and possessing Jake's eyes. The ultimate surprise, Jake arrived at the hospital, accompanied by a lawyer, seeking my signature for partial custody. He insisted that I bring him to court for full custody. All the while, a nurse anxiously lingered by the door. Cradling the slumbering infant, I shifted my gaze from my daughter's serene expression to Jake's self-satisfied grin, and in that moment, I decided it was time to make my getaway. 3 days later, I disappeared. Fresh identity, different location, no way to reach me. The owner of the bookstore, a kind elderly woman who was my sole companion, offered her assistance. I once had a sister who lived in Oregon. As the bus departed, she discreetly placed some cash in my palm and assured me she would assist in getting me established. I embraced my daughter tightly, murmuring sweet assurances into her delicate fuzzy hair. No more deceit. No more fleeing. Only we remain. The note was brief and delightful. "Richard, I regret to inform you that our daughter carries his smile. She will never know her father because of my choices. Some mistakes are irreparable, yet I am attempting to say farewell." What would you have done in Elaine's position? Could you have confronted the consequences, or would you have simply expressed your feelings on social media? And if this narrative caught you off guard, brace yourself for next week's account of a wife who discovered her husband was involved with another woman.